And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Dr. Raymond Moody, the foremost expert on the phenomena of near-death experiences. And as many of you already know, Dr. Moody coined the term near-death experience in his book, Life After Life. For half a century, he has researched some of life's greatest mysteries and has heard thousands of accounts of near-death, shared death, and after-death experiences. His new book that will be released soon, Proof of Life After Life, 7 Reasons to Believe There is an Afterlife, which we'll be talking about and more. Dr. Moody, thank you for joining me and welcome.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for having me on your program. I've really enjoyed our conversations leading up to this program.
Well, thank you. And yes, it's been great talking with you. And now I get to share you with the world. And I first wanted to start with, you've been involved with NDEs for 5 decades. What inspires you to keep researching it?
Well, what has driven me all my life, Jeff, is curiosity. I mean, to me, the learning new stuff is just the greatest time. So I can't really give you any noble purpose. Now, I will tell you this, it's like the fact that people all over the world have said my work has helped them with the grief or to help with their fear of death or whatever. That is wonderful to me. But my work was just because I'm just so curious. And I was not religious as a kid. And I was interested in astronomy and space stuff was my thing. And so I went to the University of Virginia at age 18 to study astronomy, but immediately got hooked on philosophy. My first philosophy course, reading Plato's Republic, at the very end, there's this story about a warrior who was believed dead on the battlefield. But at his funeral, he sat up and told the people around that he had gotten out of his body, went through a passageway into this other world. And I could tell that Plato took this seriously, that Plato was the first person I ever knew that took the notion of an afterlife seriously. Since I wasn't really into religion, to me, the only context I had for it was cartoons and stuff. I thought it was just like a comic premise. But all of a sudden, this hero of mine, as he already was, is talking about this is the most important question. And I got his point immediately that if this is not all there is, then we better start thinking about what comes after. And I've never lost the fascination of it, Jeff. To me, it is just astonishing. And even though there are patterns, as you know yourself from talking to so many people, there is also a uniqueness to every one of them. It's and so that's just so exciting. I'm hooked. I mean, I talk about a lot of other subjects too, but this near-death thing, I don't think I will ever lose my interest in that.
Well, you're so right that there are outliers from the patterns, which actually caused me to kind of change my beliefs or ideas about NDEs. And I'm curious, over the many years you've been into it, how have you changed?
Well, my main change in it has been I just didn't know. For all these many years, it's intriguing, but you just don't know. But very early in my career, I quit. I realized my first year in medical school that this thing about the oxygen deprivation to the brain being the causation, that is just not true. And let me explain why. My first year in medical school, I'd already been in for about 7 or 8 years. I've been interviewing people before I went to medical school, so my professors knew about my work when I came into medical school. So very early, in my first year of medical school, a professor of mine, they had what they called a Facebook with the pictures of all the new students. So this very nice woman walked up to me in the bookstore and introduced herself as Martha McCraney, the psychiatry professor. And she said, Dr. Moody, I've been wanting to talk to you about your work because I want to talk to you about this is a funny word she said, some mentation I had when I was resuscitating my mother. And so she told me the same thing. She said she was trying to resuscitate my mother. She felt her mother die, but she herself, the physician, went up above her body. She looked, she found herself there with her mother, now in spirit form, she said. She saw this passageway open and the deceased, some that relatives and friends of her mother who had already died were coming to it, and she saw her mother recede back into this land. This tunnel closed, then she was back on her body. So I realized immediately my professor was not ill or injured. Nothing about the oxygen back, yet she had the same experience. And since then, you see, I've talked to hundreds of people with this shared death experience, as we call them, who are standing there at the death of someone else, not themselves ill or injured, but they have all of these same things. People say when their grandma dies or whoever, that they leave their bodies with their dying loved one, they go toward this light. People see the whole room of the resuscitation brightens up with a light. People say that they see apparitions of their dying loved ones, deceased relatives and friends coming in. And even and this is really the most startling thing I know after having studied near-death experiences, is that there are quite a lot of people who, as a person is there dying in their presence, the bystanders empathically co-live the dying life review of the person. And for years I thought, well, this has to be somebody close to them or, just intimate family or friends. But no, some years ago, my wife and I got a communication from this ER doctor who was called to resuscitate a guy he had never laid eyes on. And he said, he was trying to resuscitate this guy, he said, this guy's life sprang up around him. And so, something is going on here that is so far beyond this standard way we have of debating it, which is some say, oh, it's just the oxygen deprivation. And they're going to stick with this despite these new findings, because the new findings, see, that's too scary for many people. They want some kind of pattern that they can fit this into something they already think they know. But and where my process too has been, I just didn't know what to think. Even I knew it wasn't the oxygen deprivation to the brain, but the fact that it's not the oxygen deprivation to the brain doesn't mean that it is life after death, right? So I just didn't know. But where I came to it just a few years ago, I get it all. I can't think of any way out of this. And I think what brought me around was, more than anything else, I have a lot of medical friends whose medical judgment I would completely trust. I mean, um, for example, I am an addicted exerciser. I mean, it's not a virtue, it's not something I should do, it's just I'm addicted. Okay. And so I'm a walker, right? And I think, for example, if heaven forbid, I were to hurt my foot, okay, what would I do? Well, I have a friend, I hope you know him, Dr. Anthony Chicoria, who is a PhD in philosophy, a PhD in physiology, an MD, and is a professor of orthopedic surgery. Okay, now I ask myself, if heaven forbid my foot was, did I surrender my foot to Anthony? Yes, right now. This is something else I know about Anthony. In 1994, he was struck in the neck by a bolt of lightning, had a cardiac arrest, left his body, went all around this resort center where he was, where his family was having a family reunion, saw what they were doing, came back, and then within some period of time, and by the way, he said not only is this real, he said it is more real than this thing that we're going through, right? And so, but after this, he suddenly developed this interest in the piano, never in his life. And he started having this recurrent dream in which he was playing a um, piano on a concert stage. And he was always playing the same music. He learned how to transcribe music and wrote out the piece, started learning the piano. And now, in addition to being a famed orthopedic surgeon, he is a concert pianist. Now, I could give you several, numerous. Eben Alexander, you may know, the Harvard neurosurgeon. I mean, if would I turn my body over to Eben for medical? Absolutely. And Evan tells me too, this is hyper real. And so, I give up because I can't figure out a way to reconcile. See that I mean, how can I say, yeah, I would turn, I'd go to all of my medical colleagues if I had a problem, and completely I would. But then what basis do I have to discard their unanimous opinion? That not only was this experience real, but it was the epitome of realness, like, far beyond the reality we experience here. So, I just give up. What else can I say? But it's like, as I gather, that there is an afterlife. Yeah.
Being a psychiatrist, I'm sure you're aware of savant syndrome and
Yeah.
probably acquired savant syndrome, like hitting your head on something. But I feel like NDEs cause some version of acquired savant syndrome because I talked to so many people, just like your friend here that became a concert pianist.
Yeah. It's artists, mainly. In Toronto, decades ago, I was up there lecturing, and this nice woman came up. You know how artists carry those big zipper cases, right? And she brought her leather zipper casing. And she explained to me that she was an award-winning artist. And she said, the reason I got into art was I had a near-death experience. She had never had any interest in art whatsoever before, but after this experience, and so, yeah, it taps into that as well.
Yeah, there's some kind of fundamental change in a person or tapping into something on the other side. I don't know, but some kind of change is happening.
Oh, yeah, a lot of changes. And it really, people always say that this experience changed me completely. And I see it myself. I got to know some of these people over a period literally of decades. And I knew some of the folks. And like George Ritchie, for example, this first living person I ever heard this from was Dr. George Ritchie, who was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia when I was an undergraduate. That sparked my interest because I knew about it from the Greeks, but I didn't know it still existed. Then I heard in 65, I heard that this Dr. Ritchie had this experience. Took the opportunity to listen to him talk about it. And immediately I said, no, I don't know what to make of this experience, but I know that this guy is completely real. He was the finest person I ever knew. And the changes that it created in George, I mean, it's amazing. It's astonishing. And it's some of the things sound so implausible, but in the little town he lived, everybody knew about this stuff. Like the internal medicine doctor in town, that it's the best internal medicine doctor in town. It's just really this wonderful guy. And he and I had a conversation about George one night. And the internist said that he respected George very much, and he sent patients to him and all. And he said that George could do these things that just didn't make sense. He said that George and the internist knew these two people, a woman and a man, and they knew them independently. They both knew this. both people. And but the two people didn't know each other. So one night, George said to my internist, Fred, he said, those two belong together. They're going to get together and get married. And just within months, it happened. So, he had some kind of uncanny ability to do things like that. Some of them are so bizarre that I don't even tell them because nobody would believe them.
Your new book is called Proof of Life After Life 7 Reasons to Believe There is an Afterlife. Now, have you moved from believing to knowing that there is an afterlife personally?
What I would say is, I am, by the way, Jeff, a genuine skeptic. And see, these so-called skeptics, they don't know what they're talking about. These people are ignoramuses, and they're an organization of them. But it's that, personally, it's okay, but they're just so adolescent. And that, I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences because I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. Well, let me explain to you what a skeptic is, because I was a professor and still am of Greek philosophy. And this term skeptic comes from Greek philosophy. Pyrrho, Pyrrho, was the founder of the skeptical movement about 20 years after the death of Aristotle. Okay. And Aristotle codified logic. So these skeptics knew logic very well. But if you think of logic, it's a machine for generating conclusions from premises, right? But what Pyrrho said was, well, just a minute here. We know this logic, but what if we apply it vigorously? And think through every question, but in the end, what we do, because this is the technique, we withhold a conclusion. That's what it means. And the reason they do it is, number one, they found if they practice that assiduously, it creates this mind expansion. It really does. And then also, if you think about it geometrically, if everybody is rushing in this direction to get to the conclusion, but you say, no, I'm not going to draw a conclusion, that deflects your vision to the side pathway, see? And you see things that everybody else has missed because they're headed to a conclusion. Now, that's what it means. Now, read that knowledge through these ignoramuses, I call them, who say, oh, I'm a skeptic. But it's what they say is, oh, I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. Well, if you unpack that sentence, it means, well, I'm a person who doesn't draw conclusions, and my conclusion is such and such. So it's so where I ran out as a skeptic is I give up. I mean, I can't think my way out of this. So that was my process. And by the way, I don't say all that because of near death experiences. See, I mean, it's the reason I'm so agitated about this is that I teach Greek philosophy. And when I get to the skeptics, see, I have to undo all the damage that these ignorant people have done to my students' minds. And that's what irritates me. It's nothing about NDEs.
Raymond, do you believe in reincarnation? And if so, do you believe that it's possible that you lived in ancient Greece?
Do I believe in reincarnation? Well, I've been through that same process with reincarnation as I did with near-death experiences, and it's gotten to the point I just give up. Now, my reason though is not that I've read about it in books or whatever. Um, Ian Stevenson, you may know, was the expert on reincarnation, and he was back in the until a few years ago he passed away. But I knew Ian very well, and I loved Ian. But I'm not talking behind his back because I told him this to his face. And we had that kind of relationship. I said, Ian, you have no ability to reason critically. He really didn't. His parents were in some sort of religion that believed in this, and Ian had a reputation for scholarship, but it was all because he was so careful about the footnotes. And you can if you got the footnotes right, And, that was all that was required for him, as long as it coincided with his view. And so I was never impressed with this. He was the world expert on reincarnation. I loved him personally, but it wasn't. I didn't think his work was worth anything. But where I really got into this was, I lived in a regular neighborhood for years. Right across the street, there was a professor of economics to that way. There was an accountant. The guy next to us here was a owned a car dealership. The guy down the street was a biochemistry professor. And, it wasn't a neighborhood that was attuned to this kind of thing. But several times during that period, these people who were totally uninterested in what I was doing, but knew what I did, they would bring their little kids to me and say, "Hi, Raymond, this is, little Jimmy here is talking about living in ancient Egypt." And so, of course, their concern was, is he losing his mind? But I didn't know much about this, but I would talk to the kids, and I know this because I don't know what exactly this is, but the kid is fine. And then that was one level of it. And then I have two wonderful kids adopted at birth. One you met, my son Carter, and my daughter Carol Ann is a Native American Blackfeet Indian from Montana, adopted at birth. And both of them, and my wife and I, we never took these kids to church. Okay, we we don't talk about life after death. Cheryl and I talk about what's for dinner, what's on the movies that night. The kids learned about life after life by looking me up on the internet. Okay, so, but both of them, related where they were, just spontaneously out of nowhere. Like when Carter was 5, we were watching TV and I was flipping through the channels with the remote control, and suddenly he became very animated. We flipped through what turned out to be the National Geographic. Very animated. Dad, that's my village. What? And he said, yeah. He said, when I was with my other mommy and daddy in China, my brothers and sisters, well, my wife was the first person to hold him, right, when he's born. And so, and so what? And man, he could tell I was dumbfounded. And then he could tell I wasn't picking it up. And then, as though to orient me, he said, yeah. And then I was up in the trees looking at you and mommy lying in the grass. And I knew exactly what he was talking about. Before he was born, Cheryl and I were in Greece, and we had gotten out of the plane a couple of days. We were exhausted. We went to this very remote site, archaeological site. It was that we were the only person there except for the attendant. And the attendant could kind of tell we were exhausted. So he just said, well, go over there and lie down in the grass and just take a nap. And these big trees all around. And we were talking about adopting a baby.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and the same thing with Carol. It's and so it's like um, David Hume was the great real skeptic. I'm not talking about these people who use that label without knowing what it means. David Hume, who greatly influenced Einstein, for example, was kind of an archetype of a modern skeptic. And he thought the notion of an afterlife was just unintelligible, right? But in his essay, he said, I think that the only form of afterlife that a philosophical person could entertain would be reincarnation. And he doesn't say why, but I think that this is probably the reason. Hume was a historian. And so historians understand the supreme importance of narrative or story for human existence, right? Because that's what they deal with, is narrative. And of all the different kinds of afterlife that people have portrayed, it's reincarnation is the most story-like, right? It's like the story is they tell a story of their life. And so, yeah, I mean, I give up on that one too. I just think that as I gather, and it's not from, I've read various scholarly publications on it, but it's more from my own experiences with my kids and other folks' kids who bring them to me.
Well, I was hoping that you would say that your passion for Greek philosophy stemmed from you being there at some point in your
It could be.
existence.
It could be. It could be. I'm a little, it's some people have said, "Oh, you must be Plato," and another, "No, I don't want that on me. No, no, no." I was just, I'm not up to that. But whether I was or not, I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised at this phase.
Right. One of my favorite Greek philosophy stories, and I don't know many anyways, but is Plato's Cave.
Yeah.
I think that's a great story we talked about here on the show once. And can you apply that to NDEs in any way, do you think?
Oh, yes, I can. Because see, Plato, that scene you're describing is in the Republic. It's kind of in the middle of the Republic. And what Plato imagines is, he said, our situation in life is like this. He said, imagine a cave down under the earth, and that there are people chained or restrained, and so that they can only look at the back wall of the cave and they can't turn around. And behind them, there's a platform with a fire and a low wall. And he said, people come and they bring objects and hold them over the wall, and the fire casts the shadows of the objects on the wall. And he said, imagine being imprisoned out there, like, for all your life, and how if you grew up in that environment, what would your opinions be? See, and one of the persons in the dialogue says, what a strange scenario. And then Socrates says, like to us, I believe. So what he was getting at, that cave is and so the interesting historical fact behind this, Jeff, is that the cave allegory refers to a specific place in ancient Greece, which is the very place where Cheryl and I were lying in the grass. And it's called the Oracle of the Dead. It was the most famous of these places they had where you could go and you could they had various procedures where you could visualize and converse with the apparitions of your dead relatives. And to make a long story short, I've been interested in this since college. It's in Herodotus. I mean, it's in a lot of the ancient writers. But I always thought, how can this be? It couldn't be. But then in 85 or 87, somewhere in there, I read an article about the fact that the most famous of the oracles of dead had been rediscovered and excavated by this Professor Soterios Dokaris, who was a very well-known classical archaeologist. I had already known about his work. And so what they found when they excavated this place, which was entirely subterranean, just like Plato had described it, and they had this, on the subterranean chamber where they saw the apparitions, there were carbon marks on the wall indicating torches. So they illuminated it down there by torchlight. Okay, and the centerpiece of it was an enormous bronze cauldron surrounded by a balustrade, which indicated that when people saw the visions, they were surrounding this cauldron. But Professor Dokaris looked at this and said, well, this must just be fraud. That they had these people down there 29 days before they went to the apparition hall. And so what Dokaris said, well, that by then the attendants could figure out what the person was like, who they wanted to see, and could hide in the cauldron and act out raw. But I thought, no. But more than that, I knew an alternate mechanism just from studying altered states of consciousness, which is many people, when they gaze into an optical depth, which is a mirror, or in the Middle East, they still do it just like the Greeks. They take a silver bowl, highly polish it on the inside, fill it with olive oil, and by candlelight in a dark room, you gaze into this surface and you see things. I mean, it's not like a mental image, which is fuzzy and all. These things are just hyper photographic reality. It's just like you're looking at. So the moment I heard that detail about the colon, oh, that's got to be it. So I set up the process. I created a room with a mirror, a comfortable chair so a person could lie and look up at the mirror, and a light behind. They could adjust the dimness. Then, after a period of preparation, it's like you ask them, what was this person like that you wanted to see? And so it just takes about an hour or two. Then you escort them into this chamber, and immediately I found out it works. I was using my graduate students of psychology who were interested in this as my subjects. I had no idea. I mean, I thought maybe it'd be about 1 out of 10, and that they would say, oh yeah, I saw an image in the mirror, it looked like my grandma, but was it real or my big, I don't know. But to the contrary, these very sophisticated people came out and saying, yeah, I saw my grandma, and no, I talked to my grandma. So this sense of reality to it.
That makes me rethink Snow White and Mirror, Mirror on
Yes,
the Wall.
mirror, mirror
I
on the
mean, how
wall.
long has that myth been around for?
Yeah, and it's been periodically rediscovered. And by the way, all this is, I'm not just talking about, all of this is in the new book too, Proof
Mm-hmm.
of Life After Life. So I'm not straying from the subject here, but and this has been well known all over the world. The guy, John Dee, who lives 1527 to 1608, was a advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, and he had discovered this. He was an early expert on archaeology. He would go around England looking at old monuments, trying to figure out what they were. But when the Spanish went to Mexico and brought back these scrying mirrors, these obsidian mirrors, highly polished, and John Dee was fooling around, and oh my God, he could see them. So for years, he conducted these experiments where in the darkness, they'd call up these spirits through the mirror. And another thing that happens sometimes is when I started doing it, I thought, well, surely, that's what it'll be, is seeing something in the mirror. And that does happen. But also, people often say that the image emerges from the mirror, come right into the room with them. Others say that they feel that their consciousness goes through the mirror into the other world where they meet their relatives. Now, John Dee um, was an early mathematician as well, and this was before mathematics was clearly dissociated from magic. And John Dee, his magic number, as it was 7. And so Queen Elizabeth had a penchant for nicknames. She would nickname people. So she nicknamed John Dee Eyes, right? Presumably because he is still respected by folks in the intelligence community as an early pioneer of intelligence work. He invented some of the principles they still use. So when he would sign his secret communications to Queen Elizabeth, he would do it by 2 circles side by side to the eyes. But then over and beside it, the 7, 007. And Fleming acknowledged in an interview once, yeah, that was the basis of the James Bond character.
I had an epiphany one time at the opera where I was seeing Figaro, and I think that was written in like the 1500s or something. But I just, after watching it, felt like, people have not changed in 500 years. And I think now, if you go back to even Plato, people have not changed in 2,000 years. The only thing that's changed is technology.
That's right. You can read all these people, and you know they've become such vibrant figures in your life. They were great folks. These early Greek philosophers, they set the agenda for all of Western civilization that has followed.
As we already stated, you're a psychiatrist and you've studied the mind more than most of us. And so, if we go back to skeptics, what is it about them mentally that they're
Mhm.
so skeptical about NDEs? And some of them won't even take a look at it. They just
Yeah.
immediately downplay it. Is that some type of fear that they're having, or what causes that blockage
What
or
that resist?
resistance? Yes.
I'm not sure. But I would say for sure that there are different reasons. It's a lot of people who resist who resist these various kinds of experiences, not just near death experiences, but apparitions and all of these things. It's because of their very narrow religious background that makes them fearful of hell and stuff like that. And many people, because of the fear that we must all in some way sense of the utter unintelligibility and mysteriousness of this thing we're in. And you and I can handle it well. To me, it's neat that there's so much unknown stuff and that it's fun to play around and think and all. But see, to some people, as you know from just observing people who are terrified to think, they want some ideology. It's like I remember when I was a kid in Porterdale, Georgia, there was a scale in the drugstore, and it said, "Your weight and fortune for a penny." Right. And there was on the left, there was January to June, and then on the right, there was July to December in little slots. And what you had to do, you had to put your penny by the month of your birth. But you could look in there and you could see they all went down to the same place. But so when you put in your penny, this card would come out with your weight printed on it. And it would give you some sort of message about, beware in affairs of all of your friends, some kind of thing like that. And that is how this religious strictness operates. It's like people just want a definite answer without having to think it through. And so they're instilled with all this ideology when they're kids, and they become fearful that if they stray outside of that ideology, they'll go to hell. And that's it. That's for many people. Then there are other people who are just so fixated on, some aspect of the material world, they can't get it. And so there's different reasons, but it's I think the fear of the unknown is a big factor in it. And people just want things to be settled and they don't want to have to think about it. Thinking about this world we're in is incomprehensible enough. But to have to then go on and to think about, oh, there's a whole another level, at least one level above this thing we're in. That's I gather, just too scary for some people.
I think the paradox about being a human over any other animal is that we know that there's a demise at some point where your dog or your cat doesn't.
And it is. There is this whole, question of the nature of us. What are we exactly? Where I've come to it, Jeff, is how old are you now?
53.
53. Okay, well, I'm 79. This is where I've come in my thinking of it. When I was 30, I think I was 34. I don't know. For a year, I was in a VIP geriatrics, a VIP geriatric clinic for psychiatry, and so and what I mean by VIP clinic is in a small town, you just don't want the chief of police or the mayor or the town celebrities who've known all over the world to be seen in the front lobby of the mental health clinic. I mean, it's not elitism, it's just kindness. So an arrangement is made that the chief of police or whoever can come in the back door, whatever. And so for a year, I was it because I was the oldest resident. Also, I was known for my book, and I'd had a PhD in philosophy, and so all those things. So for 1 year, I was able to sit there and talk to these wise old people. It was mostly, a couple of them were demented, but it was mostly just um, loneliness, really was, and or situational stress or whatever. And so repeatedly during that year, I heard these people say, Raymond, the older I get, the more I get this uncanny impression when I look back at my life that it's been like a script or a movie or a play or a novel or a story. You had to use different words, but the idea of it was that it's a drama-like thing. And so then also in terms of our consciousness, if you one aspect of consciousness that is not talked about as often as it should be is that your consciousness is mostly a narrative generating machine. Think about it. Whenever some new event happens in your life, what does your mind do? It integrates it into your continuing life story. It's just automatic. Cinematographers have figured out what they call the Kulikov effect, which is that if you take any two random um, articles, just like a newspaper thing or a Diet Coke can, hope I get some free Diet Cokes from that. Just kidding. But that you just present those randomly to people, and the mind automatically starts weaving a story to connect the two things. See? So we are narrative based. And see, that's, I think, what Hume was getting at, saying that, reincarnation is the only one that potentially made sense to him. And so, but now also being a logician, I got to say, some people might listen to that. Oh, that's just a metaphor, right? Raymond is taking one aspect of the human consciousness or the human life, namely the theater, and projecting that out as a model of the whole. That's a logical fallacy, right? It's taking a metaphor for the literal. And I understand that that would be a fallacy. However, I say that it happened the other way around, that the reason we have the theater is that wise people like Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides had just figured out that that's the characteristic of life. And so we can shrink this thing down and to condense it and put it in a flat place and act it out. And so that is how the theater came about, I think, because these early thinkers had realized the characteristic of life that it's like a story. Yeah.
I want to keep your book publicist happy, so I want to ask you a question about your new book.
Yeah.
For example, what is terminal lucidity?
Well, this is another one of those extraordinary things, Jeff, that when you hear it, you say that can't be. But if you are, for example, a geriatric, I worked in geriatrics, but also with terminally ill patients. It was one of my big specialties in medicine. You see this all the time, and it's like the first I started realizing in the hospital was one morning you'd walk into your hospital, and the relatives of one of your dying patients would come with big smiles on their faces. This morning, Grandma hasn't been saying anything for months. This morning we came in, she was lit up. She was just so happy. She talked to us all very coherently. And they take that as a sign that Grandma is going to turn around. She's going to be all right. But quickly you learn, no, that's called terminal lucidity. That even if people have been demented, they've been out of touch for a long time, just in that dying process, And I know that all these things, if you haven't seen this, folks, you're going to think I'm crazy. But just ask around among other people who work with the terminally ill. You'll see. It's like they light up. Now, I'm not talking about light that comes from the sun or from a light bulb. This emanates from within the person. You have to call it light, but it's this clarity, this light. And they are, it's like you can tell they're lucid. They just talk to everyone and give everyone a message, and then they just and sometimes people sing as they die, or recite poetry, even if they're relatives and friends. They never had any interest in poetry before, but just in the days or hours before they die, as they are dying, they recite poetry, or sometimes even make up poetry or sing. And it's the people who are impressed by this. As I had this man came all the way from Australia to visit me some years ago, because he had this experience with his wife who was dying. And he said one night he went in to just check on her. He was getting ready to go to the store for something. So he went in to say, I'm just going to the store. He said, all of a sudden she was eliminated. They had this long, very meaningful conversation. And he said, oh, she's gonna turn around. This is great. So he just went to the store. When he came back, she was dead. And he told me it was this. And I wish I could reproduce that look he had in his eyes. He said, I felt like she already had one foot on the other side. And that's what people say. So that's terminal lucidity, how this incredible turnaround, just as people are dying, they light up, and get coherent. They give a message to everybody, and that's terminal lucidity.
Do you have a favorite NDE story? I know you've heard probably thousands and thousands of them, but one that just sticks with you all these years?
I have two favorites, actually, and I mean all of them are neat, and every one of them is unique, and it's just but there are two sentimental favorites because of the depth with which I got to know these people. And the very first one was Dr. George Ritchie, the professor of psychiatry at UVA, and the first living person I heard this from. And George was a recruit in the Army in December of 1943 at Camp Barkley, Texas. I should explain that George was from Richmond, Virginia. Okay. Now, should also add that my parents were from Porterdale, Georgia. Okay. And so in 1965, I heard George talk about his experience of being there in Camp Barkley, Texas. The ward boy found him apparently dead. He had developed double lobar pneumonia. And so the ward boy was going through checking and found George apparently dead. Went to Dr. Francie, the ward doctor, and said, and Dr. Francie, as I heard specifically from him, and he said that George was dead, and so he wrote out the death certificate. But then the ward boy was going to take George's body to the morgue, but had a couple other things to do. But then when he came back, this was the first person he had seen of his own age die. And it was really shocking. So when he was moving the body, he said, I just don't feel good about this. So he went back to the doctor and begged Dr. Francie to do something. So Dr. Francie, at least 9 minutes, at least. They don't know how long he had been in the dead flu. But anyway, so Dr. Francie injected George directly into the heart with and, uh, adrenaline. Okay, and George came back and told about leaving his body, about seeing a panoramic review of his life, everything he'd ever done, and all these other amazing things. And so now, that was 1965. Flash forward to 1976, 12 years later. I had finished my book, and the only contact I'd have with George in those intervening years was in 75, just before the book was to be published. I called him and I asked him if I could dedicate it to him. And he said, okay. But that was the only contact. All right. Now, I went to medical school in Georgia, a medical college in Georgia, and graduated in January of 76. And my book was just then sort of getting to be a big bestseller. So I decided to go back to Charlottesville for my psychiatry residency. So in March of 76, we were going up to Charlottesville to so I could do my interviews for my psychiatry residency. And while we were there, just called up Dr. Richie and said, oh, by all means, come over and have dinner. Okay. Now, next day, we flew back to Macon, Georgia. My parents had been taking care of my kids. And so that evening, I was just sitting there in the den with my dad, who was a surgeon and a very, like a professional medical, professional military officer, surgeon. Put those two personalities together, you got my dad, right? Okay. So by then, my dad had heard a tape of Dr. Ritchie's experience. And so I said, last night we were with this Dr. Ritchie, this first one. And my dad said the following things, which I remember exactly, because by then I understood that what's called telegraphic speech, where you sound like you're talking on the telegram, that's a sign of anxiety. And I remember the expression on my dad's face when he said, he said, he said, George Ritchie, Camp Berkeley, Texas, December 1943. He said, I was there, and so were you. And Mom and Dad had moved to Camp Berkeley in early September 1943 so that my dad could go to officers candidate school. I was conceived in late September 1943, late September 1943. George's experience was, I think, December 24th, 1943. My mom and dad moved away from Camp Berkeley on December 29th, 1943. So I was there. Now, another one is this wonderful woman I knew in Augusta, Georgia, knew her for many years after. She was named Vi Horton, and she had this incredible experience, much like George's, getting out of the body, seeing this life review, and seeing into what appear to be other realms of existence. Both George and Vi and many other people I've talked to who had these extremely lengthy cardiac arrests talk about, you can see this, that there's several layers of that. They say that they see right near us in this level, there seem to be folks that don't quite get it, that they're dead. And they're fumbling around, sort of repeating things. And this is in the ancient Greeks too, knew about this, but it came from, you hear it in modern near-death experiences and these extremely lengthy cases where the arrest goes on for so long a period of time. But people say that, and George and others have said that it sounds distressing that these people don't quite get it, that they're dead. And they're repeating and all. But George said it's nothing very serious. He said it's like, because even then you see these people coming, enlightened people coming in and out among them, trying to, hey, wake up, wake up. Then, then the next level up, there's this, it's many people have described it to me. They say it's like, if you try to imagine Caltech and MIT and Harvard and Yale and Princeton and all of them squeezed into one place, you couldn't even begin to imagine this. So like a whole layer of existence where people are learning. And So, both of these stick out in my mind as my favorite ones, but it was probably more just because of the immense personal connection I had to these two people, because they're, all of the things they say are things I hear in plenty of other near death experiences too.
Quite a few of my guests during their near death experience end up in a room, like a
Yeah.
like an office room. And
Oh, okay.
they're like or a waiting room, I think is usually what they describe it as, like a waiting room. And
Oh,
it's not
interesting.
like in a heavenly place or at the
Uh-huh.
beach or the forest, but this
Oh,
waiting
interesting.
room. Yeah, and I was just curious if
Yeah.
you heard that or if you knew anything
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, I can't remember hearing of that, but it certainly is interesting.
Hmm.
It one case that does come to my mind was a Ricky Bradshaw was his name, and it was not an empty room, but he was 19 years old, I think. He was working in a grocery store, and his job was to take out groceries and put them in people's trunks. But one day, when he was doing this, putting the groceries in a woman's trunk, another person came back like a woman. Her car was lost control, and she leant forward and she caught Ricky's legs between the bumper of her car and the um, the other car. And then in her panic, she put it into reverse and then backed out. But then in her panic, it dropped into drive again. So when she was trying to, she went again. And by then he's collapsed on the bumper and hit him across his chest. And he was in the hospital for 18 months. And I talked to the doctors involved in this. They said it just didn't make any sense that he was alive. And they told him he'd never walk again. 18 months after he got out of the hospital, he climbed a mountain with me in Virginia. And this was an extraordinary case. It was, there's a ghastly thing called trauma of the year. I mean, it's like the worst trauma. And Ricky was it for 1 year. And he said that when he got out of his body, he found himself in this room. And he said it was filled with music. And so when he went in, he said he had been was really interested in speakers and all that stuff. So he said when he went into this room, he was trying to figure out where all this music was coming from. So he automatically just looked around, just to try to find the speakers. And he said there were these people in this room. And the first comment from him was not in words, but just like the thought was, what do you think about this sound system, Ricky? But he had this interview with him and they sort of reviewed his life with him. Yeah, but that's the only room case I can think of. But, there may be more I might have just forgotten.
Before starting this podcast, I never would have expected to have so many people write to me and tell me how these near-death experience stories help them with their grief.
Yeah,
What kind of advice do you have for people who are grieving over the loss of a loved one?
I would say first and foremost, talk about it. I mean, in my grief I had, my life, my major grief, it was talking that finally, and talking and crying. It took me 5 years to cry, but once I did, it got much better. Another thing about it, grief never, in my opinion, hardly ever just totally goes away. I lost my first child in 1970 at the age of 36 hours. It still haunts me. I mean, there's certain things and so that's one thing I think is to acknowledge that yeah, grief is painful and it does go on. Where I have been in it, if you think about the situation when my son died and I was 20 something, um, and if you think of me then as like um, it's like just draw a circle on the piece of paper about the size of say a 50-cent piece or quarter, right? And if that was me at this point, whereas the circle just suddenly got eclipsed, It was like a darkness came over the and just filled it up, except for a little sliver, just and it was and you didn't even know what word to put out. This was 1970. People didn't talk about grief. All I knew was I was just in this indescribable despair, which filled me up. Now, if you ask me um, how many years later this is, 53, I guess, how that situation is, I would say the grief is still the same. There's still that little quarter, but now it's worse because that edge that was on it. Now he would have been 6 years old, so now it's a little more. Now he would be a man. Every point there's a little further loss, but the difference is, see, now whereas this was me in 1970, now this is. It's like the circle has enlarged, but the grief has remained the same. It's the grief fills up that same space, but my consciousness has expanded around it so that it occupies a lesser percentage of my conscious field, but it's still there, is how I would say. So grief itself stimulates you to grow, your consciousness to grow, which doesn't justify it. I wish it had never happened, but what can you do?
Where do you see the future of near-death experience research going?
Thank you for that, because it's headed in a very positive direction. Because what we can do now is we can solve the ineffability problem, or greatly ameliorate it. And by the ineffability problem, I mean, is that probably the most common thing that people say when they have a near-death experience is, I just can't describe it to you. This is beyond words. William James called that ineffability, that we have no words for it. Now, for some years now, I've been doing a study where what I've done is logic was my thing, philosophy of language, and I developed, even in graduate school, ways of thinking about things that don't appear to make sense, right? Like there's a set of logical rules you can apply that normally, if we reach something that makes no sense or is unintelligible, we just stop, right? But now with new logical principles, we can get through that. But it's like what I've learned is you can prepare people in advance with exercises and so on, not directed to life after death. This is for practical purposes. I've done these workshops for advertising people and psychologists and all kinds of businesses and such. But once you have these principles, then when you subsequently have a near-death experience, you'll be able to talk about it in a new way. It's happened already once. This very brilliant man, oh my God, the brilliance! He worked with Bell of the Bell theorem. He knew Philo Farnsworth, the inventor of the TV. He's an eminent sculptor and scientist who attended one of my workshops on this logic years ago. Then some years later, had a near-death experience. And he said while he was still over there, he said he realized that what I was saying is true, and that it did change his description is alternate from the ones that we hear, and because what we can do with this, see, is we already have thousands of near-death experiences thought of through the logic of Aristotle, making it literal. Now we have this other one, see, to think about it, and that when people go into a near-death experience, they will be able to talk about it in a new way. That'll give us what we call parallax. Here we have these existing ones. In the future, we're going to have this new way of looking at it. That gives you parallax, like a way of, it's like the way they know how far out it is to Alpha Centauri, right? Well, when the Earth is here, you measure the angle, then wait 6 months later, it's 186,000 miles away, and you measure it again, so you get a difference. We're able now to do that with near-death experiences. So I think that's going to bring around a whole new era.
That's great. Your book again is called Proof of Life: 7 Reasons to Believe There's an Afterlife. Is it out yet? And if not, when will it be out?
It is out now. I mean, it's really, I've got copies of it, and it's been circulated around. It's doing well, thank goodness, on the categories, that in which I'm, happy because, like you, Jeff, what I want to do is serve people. I mean, it sounds so idealistic when you're a kid. The happiest life is to serve others, and that's an ideal when you're a kid. Then you get into midlife and it becomes kind of aspiration. By the time you're 79 years old, it's just a fact of experience. Because you learn, whenever you're trying to think of yourself, do for yourself, you're always miserable. It's only when you can get out and just want to serve people that you're happy. And so I'm hoping the book really sells a lot, but not because of the financial thing. I think this is information that, as I've seen for years with NDEs, this is really beneficial, I think, for people in their spiritual quest.
Well, your books have probably helped far more people than you ever would have clinically.
You're absolutely right. It's true. I mean, because I get the most wonderful letters all the time. I mean, it's just so touching. And I'm, mm, what can you say? I'm just really humbled by it. I don't know why God gave me this particular task. I didn't really choose it, but I'm happy that this helps people. And for that reason, I hope the book really does well.
Do you only find your book on Amazon, or is it also available on your
Oh, no.
website?
Yeah, my website is, I don't know if it is or not yet, but I'm sorry, because, it's just coming out. But it's I know a lot of people have been ordering it from Amazon, but there's lots of ways to order it because I know they have a lot of pre-orders, but it's just days. And I think it'll be out in the bookstores really soon too. But you can order it online, yes.
Is there anything else you're working on that you want us to know about?
Well, you know, for one of them is you will see the connection immediately. And that is, for some years, I've been working on a book on grief. So, I'm hoping that will come in the next few months. And also because of my interest in philosophy of language, I've been working for many years on a book on figures of speech that tries to make it an exciting topic rather than a bore. I've taught it for years. And so those are the two things I'm working on right now. But the figures of speech thing is important, see, for the afterlife, because when people talk about afterlife, it's usually they use figures of speech rather than literal language, right? But those are the two things. But the afterlife thing, that's going to go on and on because I am booked now. It's just one of the most fascinating topics there is.
Well, at least I've got 2 reasons to bring you back.
Hey, great.
Well, Dr. Moody, before we finish up, can you leave us with one last positive message?
Well, number one, just thanks, folks, for listening to this so long because, I mean, I know how time is and stuff, and it's just such a touching thing to me that people would listen. So, I mean, thank you so much for that is the main thought. And then the other is I am confident to say that we're really kind of on the cusp of a real conceptual breakthrough in the rational investigation of an afterlife. I just really wouldn't be surprised if in the next decade or so that it becomes a genuinely rational field of study.
It would be amazing to think about that if it was just generally understood by
Yeah.
everybody that we
Yes,
are eternal beings and there's an afterlife
that's right.
and we go on to something next.
That's right. And I think it will happen in 2 stages. It's because in reality, the mind and the logic we have just won't work to prove the afterlife. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to work on our own minds and add some new logical principles and some new mental faculties. But that is perfectly doable. I absolutely guarantee you. And so that with this development, I think we're just going to get into a whole new world with the afterlife. I do think I've heard there's this wonderful man. He was the founder of McDonnell Douglas Aircraft, and it was McDonnell where it originally was, and Jim McDonnell. And he was a dear friend of mine. And in 1976, Jim said, well, I want to support this research, he says, because if we could prove the afterlife, his idea was that make everything okay and that, the world would be wonderful. And there would be some of that. But I think there's another thing about that is that even people with near-death experiences will tell you that, and they saw in their near-death review, their life review, the importance of love, and they bring that back. And they say, what this is all about is love. But then they also say, but it doesn't make it much easier. You can see this, the sweep of this and the importance of it. But when you get back in a human body and there's all these things, it's like George Ritchie came over to my house one day unsolicited. He said, Raymond, he just stopped by and he said, Raymond, he said, this experience makes your humanity even more of a burden in a way. And George was such a kind person, he would never say it this way, but I'm saying it this way. Because I've heard this same sentiment, as I'm sure you have, from a lot of people. And what I'm getting at is, let's face it, it's very difficult to get through the average day without wanting to choke at least one person. That's the human reality, even if you've had a near-death experience. So I told Jim, my friend, I said, Jim, that's a noble thought, but I'm not sure that it would bring about nirvana on the earth, but I am sure that it would bring about a monumental change in the human mind and consciousness, which would eventually accumulate in a rational proof of an afterlife, is what I think.
Well, Dr. Moody, thank you so much again for being my guest. I really appreciate you, and I wish you massive success with your book.
Thank you, Jeff, and I wish you massive success with your work, which is so wonderful. You have such a great life story. And I just appreciate this so much, Jeff. I mean, you're just such a wonderful person. And to the folks, listening to, thank you for this. I'm just so grateful to everybody who, is interested in this.
Thank you, Dr. Moody, and have a great evening.
You too.
Thanks for watching the Jeff Mara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.